Well, good evening, everybody. I'm KJ. I'm the director for the C.S. Lewis Institute in Chicago, and I'm really pleased to have you join us again. Tonight, we have Dr. Joe Rigney, Bethlehem College and Seminary, future dean, rejoining us. He's taken us through the first two books in the Chronicles of Narnia, and tonight we're going to go into book number 3. As we've learned, the orthodox method is doing it in publication order, not chronological order, like my book has it. I was sad to realize, Joe, that when I cracked open my book after the first session, to my horror, I didn't realize, because I'd bought it and put it on the shelf. It was a fancy one. I never even looked to see what order it was in. And I was just, I almost threw it in the trash. But you can't throw any Lewis book away.
Oh,
I just went into the table of contents and I actually
right.
wrote a year on each one to remind myself for future reference.
That's right. You can just modify it. It's no big deal.
That's right. Anyhow, we're glad to have you back, Joe. We're really excited to dive right into the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And we're also excited, we'll talk about this a little bit more at the end, but we have settled on some dates to take this all the way through to the last battle. So you're with us for the long haul.
That's right, all the way to July. So I hope a number of you folks can join us for the next few months as we continue our way through all of the Chronicles. And I'm very excited about it. I love those. I love the later books too. So I want to make sure we get them all in.
It's not complete without them. Well, maybe before I jump off, just want to remind folks at the end, we'll rehearse those dates so you know when to rejoin us. But since you're with us and you registered, if for some reason you missed those dates, you can just go back to that same website and the dates are listed right there, and you can register for each one of those dates, and you can register now through the end of it in July and have those times and dates blocked off so you don't miss a thing. And hopefully we'll be out of this pandemic by then and be vaccinated. And we can maybe gather in groups. I know this probably would have been a lot more fun if folks could get together in their reading groups and go through these books together. So, well, I'm gonna tune out here, Joe, and I'm gonna turn it over to you. So thanks for rejoining.
Yeah, glad to be here. Greetings, everybody. I assume that some of you have probably been here with us for the last 2 sessions. And if you haven't, they're online, and I'm sure they'll drop those in the chat there for you to find if you want to go find our discussion of Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and Prince Caspian. But we've now come to the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and I'm assuming a bunch of you probably reread the books like I did in preparation for this evening. But in case you didn't, I wanted to give a little bit of a kind of overview of the book itself before diving into a handful of lessons and insights and observations about it. And then like in weeks or months past, we'll at the end leave a big chunk of time for some questions. So be storing those up. If you have favorite moments or questions you want to have about the book, save those for the end. I'm eager to engage with you guys about those. So the basic story here of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader is it's a journey, and it's a voyage in particular. It's a particular voyage. It's the seafaring book in the Narnian series. And so you've got in this book, Peter and Susan don't appear, as we discovered last time in Prince Caspian. They're unable, forbidden, to come back to Narnia, and there are reasons for that, which we find out in this book. Why is it that sometimes you apparently age out of Narnia? But Peter and Susan aren't allowed to come back, but Edmund and Lucy are. And they're talking about it. They're getting excited about it. But unfortunately, they have to stay with their stinker of a cousin, Eustace Clarence Scrubb. And that with that name, he almost deserved that name. So they're staying with him and then find themselves whisked away to Narnia once again, but this time on a voyage with Prince Caspian, a few years older. And the basic premise of the book is that Caspian is set out, now that peace has been established in restored Narnia, to find the 7 lost lords. So these are 7 friends of his father's who were banished, or sent, I should say, by King Miraz, the usurper, on a journey to the world's end, just to get rid of them. And so they never came back. And now Caspian has sort of committed himself. I'm going to find out what happened to them. And so he's going to go on this journey on the ship, the Dawn Treader. Joining him, of course, is Reepicheep the Mouse, who we met in Prince Caspian, as well as a number of other sailors and the Lord Rigney and the captain of the ship. And so as they journey, it's a really interesting chronicle because it's very episodic. what I mean by that is if you were going to actually, if you try to make a Narnia movie, which they have, and as I talked last time, I think somewhat ineffectively, but if you try to make a Narnia movie, the whole thing kind of hangs together pretty well for a film. This one actually is a little bit harder, precisely because basically you have a series of episodes as they go from island to island. So it would actually work a lot better, I think, as sort of a mini series or something like that. So each journey island or something like that might be a different episode or a couple of episodes on each one. But they journey through across the seas as they're heading east toward the sun. That's going to be significant in a minute. We talk about that. And they visit the Lone Islands, and then Dragon Island and Burnt Island and the land of the Dufflepuds, then Dark Island, Ramandu's Island, and then they eventually make it to the World's End, and Aslan's own country. And so that's where they're headed. And at each place along the way, they have various adventures, challenges. Each of the characters sort of face fundamental challenges in relation to their own personalities and interests and so forth. And so it's a really wonderful book precisely because of this notion of the journey. And that's actually what I wanted to talk about from the lessons that we can take away. Because I think one of the things Lewis intends for us to see from this book is the Christian life as a voyage, the Christian life as a journey, as a voyage. And it's a particular one. So if we sketched it out, we might think here as they journey east that they're heading toward the sun, and the sun is going to, in Narnia, gets brighter and brighter and brighter. Apparently Narnia is not a globe like our world. They talk about this. It's not a globe. It's not round, but is apparently flat. And so they head east and the sun's coming up. And as they get closer and closer to the world's edge, the sun gets brighter and brighter and brighter and bigger and bigger and bigger. And so that's a really interesting thing. And we might think of that as sort of the journey towards God, the journey towards the light, the journey towards our heavenly home, something like that. And then along the way, we're going to get these different episodes that sort of display various trials and temptations that we face in the Christian life. And so I want to highlight maybe one or two, maybe three. I don't know. I'll see how many I do in this part. If you want to ask about others, ask about others. But I want to start, of course, with our hero, or not so hero, Eustace Clarence Scrubb. Eustace is a really interesting character. He's very, as we talked about in the first book, Edmund is a sort of character that has his own narrative arc where he starts out as kind of a stinker and a nasty kid who picks on others and is a little bit of a bully and a scoffer and a jerk, and then has to sort of go through his up and down moment in the first book where Aslan basically redeems him from his treachery and death and restores him so that he becomes King Edmund the Just. We have a similar narrative arc here with Eustace. So when we meet Eustace, of course, as I said, he's kind of a stinker. He loves to poke and provoke his cousins, make fun of them. Doesn't seem like he has a lot of friends. The family that he comes from is really kind of interesting in what Lewis is doing there. Eustace doesn't call his parents by the names mom and dad or mother and father, but by their first names, Harold and Alberta. Harold and Alberta Scrubb. So he refers to his parents as that. And this seems, Lewis is a bit essentially trying to show this is a sort of a progressive family, progressive in the mid-century sort of way. This was kind of the cool new thing, is that we treat our children like adults from the time they're children. We're individuals, and we need to engage with each other as sort of rational, autonomous individuals. And so Harold and Alberta have taught Eustace to do this. And so it's not as much of a family as sort of different units, interchangeable units within the quote unquote family. They're very up to date and advanced people, we're told. They're vegetarians, non-smokers, and teetotalers. So that, today you could substitute, those are sort of the traits associated with that in Lewis's day. You could update your own if you want, in terms of the sort of up to date on the latest sort of scientific fads and dietary fads or whatever, and very austere when it comes to their furniture, their clothing, and that sort of thing. And from his family, we find Eustace is a pacifist. He's an egalitarian, and that and a feminist. He sort of thinks, he says, Alberta always taught that honoring women by sort of giving Lucy the big room because she's a woman and we want to show honor to her. That's actually lowering girls. And so we want to level things out. But of course, his real motivation is he wants the big room. He wants to have the nice place because now we're all equal. And so he should have a turn in the nice cabin on the ship. So that's sort of his worldview or his perspective from his family. But he himself, as I said, is a stinker. He's a complainer, a whiner, a provoker, right? He picks Reepicheep up and swings him around by the tail because he thinks it'll be funny. And Reepicheep pulls out his sword and stabs him and wants to have a duel, which Eustace avoids. But he's not a good character. He complains the whole time for the first part of the journey. And then, of course, they eventually make it to an island, which they come to call Dragon Island, where Eustace tries to get out of work. They're having to repair the ship after a big storm. And Eustace is going to go up into the mountain and sort of sleep it off while everybody else is working hard and then come back at the end of the day. And so he sneaks away, kind of gets lost and ends up in a valley. And really interesting the way that the book sort of narrates this. He ends up in a pit from which he cannot get out. He's trapped in a pit. And just as he realizes this, he turns around and an old dragon comes lumbering out of the cave and then dies right in front of him. And so this, of course, he has this nice little moment where he kind of comes up and kicks the dragon and then starts to feel like, I killed that dragon. And you can sort of pick up on the sort of things, the mentality he has of, look what a great conqueror I am. But then he goes into the dragon's cave because it's raining and finds, of course, all of the dragon's treasure, because this is what dragons do. They collect treasure. And so here's all the treasure. And he begins to have greedy and dragonish thoughts about all of the things he can do with this wealth. And that with all of this wealth, he can sort of put Edmund and Lucy back in their place and tell Caspian what's what, and sort of imagining himself as the great figure. It's a very similar thing that happened to Edmund when the White Witch tempts him to become the king under her, and begins to dream how he's going to pay back Peter and so forth. So very similar there. But then he's tired, he falls asleep, and he wakes up and he's been turned into a dragon. He's become a dragon, thinking dragonish thoughts. On top of a dragon's horde, he himself has become a dragon. Now, this, of course, is the narrative version. But if we probe into this, what we really see is that up until this point, Eustace has always been a dragon. Okay, he's been a dragon in boy's skin. He's been a dragon in the shape of a boy, in the shape of a human. He's been sort of a serpent. He's a brood of vipers. That's the kind of character he is. And now, through this transformation, he becomes on the outside what he always was on the inside. He gets to sort of see himself as he really is. And at first, his initial reaction to this is like, whoa, now I'm powerful. I don't need to be afraid of anybody. I'm going to get Reepicheep back. I'm going to get Caspian back. Everybody's going to be terrified of me. I'm on top of the world. And then immediately sort of collapses, realizing, but I'm alone. I don't want to be alone. I just want to have friends. And there's this moment of sort of self-recognition as he realizes the sort of character that he's been the whole time. He realizes that he's a jerk and begins to I have not been he hasn't been a nice person. He wanted to be around people. He even wanted Reepicheep. And so now he's weeping and crying. He heads back and meets everybody, and everybody's like, oh wow, Eustace, you got turned into a dragon, you can't talk. And then he sets out to sort of be a good person. He wants to be a helper now. And so he's finding them food on the island and tearing up a tree so they can make a new mast and trying is helpful. But everybody sort of realizes we can't take a dragon with us on this journey. What are we going to do? And the way that Eustace gets out of this mess is really instructive. And I think Lewis intends for us to see in it a parable or an illustration of conversion, what it's like to become a Christian. And in fact, not just any conversion. There's lots of different stories people have, sort of the Apostle Paul getting knocked off his horse, or the person who gets raised in a faithful Christian home and can never really remember a time when they didn't trust in Jesus. For Eustace, it's much more of that confrontation. But what's interesting is when he describes what happened to him to be undragoned or de-dragoned, he says, Aslan comes to him and says, follow me, which he does. And as he's following Aslan, he eventually comes to this pool, and the lion says, go ahead, take a bath. And you need to undress yourself to take a bath. And so Eustace goes, oh, I'm a serpent. I can sort of scratch my skin off. And he sheds his skin and he thinks, oh, that feels a lot better. But then he looks down and it's no different. Right. So he shed his skin, but it's just as scaly and hard and nasty as it was before. And so then he's, I'll again. And so he scrapes it off again. And then he does it again. He scrapes it off a third time. And this is the sort of thing that Lewis recognized in his own conversion story. as he was making the move from atheism to Christianity, one of the stops along the way was at a sort of idealism, a belief that the world is governed by a supreme mind, not necessarily a person, but some kind of intelligence, and a moral intelligence at that, and that the task of human beings was to sort of live in harmony with the universal intelligence by doing good things, by doing the good. And before that, he'd been an atheist, and so didn't really have an overarching standard over him. And now he's going to set out to be a good person. And he finds one of the things he finds, as he describes in his autobiography, is the more he realized that he wanted to be good, the more he realized he was in fact not good. The failures, the hardships, the sin that would sort of rise up, the harder he tried, the worse he realized he was. And so we see a little bit, I think, in Eustace's story, and he's trying to sort of clean himself up. He's trying to de-dragon himself and finding it to be utterly ineffective. Underneath, when he's successful, there's still a dragon underneath. There's layer upon layer of dragon. It's dragon all the way down. And so he realizes is no good. And at this point, Aslan looks at him and says, "You're going to have to let me undress you." And Eustace is afraid, but he lets him do it. And this is what the book says: "The very first tear he made was so deep, I thought it had gone right into my heart. And when he began pulling the skin off, it hurt worse than anything I've ever felt. The only thing that made me able to bear it was just the pleasure of feeling the stuff peel off. You know, if you ever pick the scab of a sore place, it hurts like bilio, but it is such fun to see it coming away." And so Aslan peels the stuff right off, and there it is, all of the dragon skin lying on the ground, very thick. And then he feels very tender, and then Aslan throws him into the water so that he can have a bath. And it stings for a moment, but then he has this great, glorious swim, and he realizes, "I'm a boy again." And so what we see here is sort of a great picture of conversion, of our efforts to sort of de-dragon ourselves, meeting with utter failure, followed by the true remedy, which is we need to have Aslan, we need to have Jesus sink his claws and sort of strip away who and what we are. We need to have a new heart, because otherwise it's just dragon all the way down. And then, of course, the beautiful picture there of having been stripped away, he gets baptized. So you get the baptism of Eustace Clarence Scrubb right there in the middle of the book, as he is de-dragoned, baptized, and he comes back a new man. And from this point on, the book highlights that from that time on, he was a very different boy. And then the narrator qualifies, which I think is important. He began to be a different boy. He had relapses. There were still many days when he could be very tiresome, but most of those I shall not notice. The cure had begun. And so here in this beginning, as we're thinking about sort of the book, the voyage of the Dawn Treader, as a metaphor or a picture of the Christian life, we have a conversion story for rotten stinker Eustace Clarence Scrubb. Now, if we continue on from there, we can see in other episodes in the story sort of the nature of the Christian life. We have a number of different, what I would call temptation or trial narratives for various different characters. And so, for instance, when they land on a particular island, the main characters, Edmund and Lucy and Eustace and Caspian and Reepicheep, all go kind of strolling through the island to kind of stretch their legs and explore. And they come upon this lake, and they look down in the lake, and they see a gold statue. At first they find all of some armor lying around and think, "Oh, this was the armor of one of the lords we're looking for, but where's his bones? Where's his body? It's not here. What happened? This is really strange." And then they come to the edge of this pool. They look down, and there's a gold statue sort of like this with his hands up, right? Like he just dove in the water. And they think, "Wow, that's amazing. There's no way we could get that out. It's too heavy. It looks like it's made of solid gold. Well, let's see how deep it is." And so he sticks a pole down, and they realize, oh no, this pool turns everything to gold. So it's like the King Midas touch. It's the King Midas lake. And immediately there's we see a very important moment when Caspian sort of realizes whoever owns this island would be the richest man ever, the richest of all kings. And he says, "This is a Narnian island. It's Goldwater Island, and everybody needs to be secret. Don't tell anybody about this island on pain of death," right? And so it's like, whoa, this is really out of character. And then Edmund fires back, "Who are you talking to? I'm not a subject of yours. I'm an ancient king. This is my island. And then, oh, it's come to that, King Edmund, and Caspian goes to pull his sword out. And so here we have a picture of Caspian and Edmund in the grip of avarice, in the grip of greed, and beginning to fight over it. And then immediately, all of a sudden, everything dies away. They look across, and coming towards them without noise, without looking at them, shining as if he were in bright sunlight, though the sun had in fact gone in, there's the hugest lion that human eyes have ever seen, size of an elephant. Nobody dared ask what it was. They knew it was Aslan, and then all of a sudden he's gone. This is really interesting, right? So they're in the moment of this temptation over fighting over wealth, of greed and avarice, and then they see Aslan, and it sort of dissipates. They kind of snaps them out of it, and instead of naming it Goldwater Island, they rename it Deathwater Island, and they leave. They're delivered from that temptation. And we see a similar thing happen in when they arrive at Coriakin's Island, which is the land of the Duffers. We can talk more about the Dufflepuds maybe in the Q&A. But the interesting thing here is when Lucy, who has been conscripted into delivering the Duffers from their invisibility, they're invisible, and they need her as a little girl to go up and read the magician's spell book and bring them back so they can be seen. And as she's up there, she starts flipping through the magician's book, and she herself faces her own temptation. In one of the spells that's on offer there is a spell that will make the one who says it the most beautiful, an infallible spell to make beautiful her that uttereth it beyond the lot of mortals. And so she's thinking about that, and she looks at the picture surrounding the spell, and she sees a girl standing at a big book in a magician's room, and it's her. And you know, she has a terrible expression on her face, and all of a sudden she says, she chants it, and the picture starts to change, and the girl becomes dazzlingly beautiful. And now there's other pictures, and you see men fighting for her hand and for her favor, nations going to war over her favor, sort of like the Greeks and the Trojans fighting over Helen of Troy. And so there's wars and waste because she's the most beautiful it is. And then she goes back to her own world, and Susan had always been sort of the older, prettier one. And now Lucy just dazzles all eyes, and nobody thinks about Susan anymore. And then Lucy says, I will say the spell. I don't care. I will. And the narrator comments, she said, I don't care, because she had a strong feeling that she mustn't. Like, she knows this is wrong, but she's going to say the spell. And then before she can do so, though, she found the great face of a lion, of the lion, Aslan himself, staring into hers out of the book. And it's big and it's bright, and it was growling. You could see most of his teeth. She became afraid and turned the page at once before she utters the spell. And so again, notice the similarity, right? Whereas earlier, the two, Caspian and Edmund, were tempted by greed and avarice, and it was the sight of Aslan that sort of snapped him out of it. Here again, Lucy's tempted by vanity, by the desire to be more beautiful than others and to then lord it over them. And she's tempted by that. And Aslan, the sight of Aslan, is what delivers her yet again. Now it's also interesting that because she resists the great temptation, the temptation of vanity here, she immediately succumbs to a smaller temptation, the temptation of eavesdropping. And she says a spell so that she can learn what her friends really think of her. And Lewis is kind of interesting here. So she overhears one of her friends sort of talking like, I don't really care about Lucy, in order to impress an older girl. Oh, that peasantry kid, she's fine her own way, but I'm not really that into her. And Lucy's indignant at this. How dare she? I thought she was my friend. And later she realizes how wrong this was. Aslan sort of says, you were eavesdropping. Was that wrong? Well, of course it was wrong. You were spying on your friend. Well, but she said nasty things about me. Well, she was intimidated. She really does have a good heart. She really does like you, but she was intimidated by the older girl. And then Lucy realizes, I'm never going to get those words out of my head. I'm always going to think that she said that. I heard what she said. And Aslan says, yep, that's the way it goes. There's consequences to your actions. So she fails. She succeeds at one test, seeing Aslan's face, and then fails at another. But part of the point here is each of these characters is facing a different temptation. Maybe one more temptation, and then we'll maybe talk about one or two other things before opening it up for some questions. One of the more interesting elements of the book, in my mind, is the way that it treats the temptation or the trial of fear and despair. And so there's a really interesting island that they visit, the Dark Island. And they sort of get badgered into it by Reepicheep, who's like, they come across this, big blackness, and they're all thinking, we don't want to go in there. Do we? Let's just go around it. Let's go around the big, black void here. And Reepicheep sort of badgers them and says, no, this is an adventure. Don't be a coward. And so they go along with it, and they head into the blackness, and they're all afraid. And they eventually hear a scream, and they rescue Lord Roop, who has been trapped on this island. And Lord Roop says, turn around and flee. This is the island where dreams come true. And of course, immediately everybody thinks that sounds pretty cool. Like, this, the island where dreams come true, that'd be great. I've got dreams. I want my dreams to come true. And then Roop says, no, you don't understand. I don't mean your daydreams, your fantasies, the things that you choose to dream about. I mean your real dreams. Those are going to come true. And all of a sudden, everybody sort of thinks, whoa, think about the worst dream you ever had. What if it came true? And immediately they're turning around and they're heading out and trying to get away from the Dark Island. And as they do, all of their fears start to rise to the surface, and they begin to hear things like there's a pair of scissors opening and shutting. One of the characters apparently is afraid of scissors. I think Eustace is afraid of scissors. And then, oh no, I hear them crawling up the sides of the ship. So somebody's afraid of something coming to get them. And then all of a sudden they realize, man, it took us about 5 minutes to get to the island through the darkness. We've been going for about 10 minutes and we're not out yet. Oh no, we're never going to get out. We're trapped here. We're trapped in this island where fear is going to take over. And in fact, Lucy herself is trying not to think about her worst fear, which is the fear that if she were to go up to Edmund and Caspian, that sort of dream you have where you come up to someone and you want to talk to them, and then all of a sudden they turn into a totally different person right when you get there. She's worried that's going to happen. That's her worst fear. And so all of a sudden everybody's fears are up. And then you've got the despair of Lord Roop, who thinks, I'm trapped. I'm never going to get out of this darkness. And in that moment, Lucy basically prays, right? Aslan, if ever you loved us at all, send us help now. And then all of a sudden, an albatross comes wheeling through sort of by light, with light shining from it, shaped like a cross, and circles around the mast 3 times and uttering something that no one understands, but that is an encouragement to them, flies by Lucy and says, courage, dear heart. And she was like, that's Aslan. And then they follow the albatross out of the darkness. And so this is a picture of the temptation of despair and fear, and the way that it can be paralyzing and breed hopelessness. Now, one of the things I really think is interesting about this scene, here's a little inside Narnia baseball, is in the first edition, the British edition, when it was published, when they come out into the warm blue world again, and all at once everybody realized there was nothing to be afraid of and never had been, that it was all in their heads, that they had only been afraid of themselves, basically, like the fears that they had, they'd manufactured those inside the Dark Island. And they blink their eyes, they look around, oh man, what a beautiful world. And they all feel kind of silly. I reckon we've made pretty good fools of ourselves. And then Lord Roop says, I have one request, never take me back to that island. And then they all turn back and they see only bright blue sky, bright blue sea and bright blue sky. The dark island and the darkness had vanished forever. And then Lord Roop cries, you've destroyed it. And then Lucy says, I don't think it was us. And then off they go. That's the version I suspect that many of you read. That's what most modern editions have. Now, the interesting thing here on this heading is that when Lewis was going to, when the book was going to be published in America, when it was first released in America, there's an alternative section. So if you have certain editions of the book, published in the, 60s and 70s, American editions, this scene is actually very different. It's all the same about what happens when they're in the darkness and getting let out by Aslan as an albatross and courage, dear heart. All that's the same. And then they come out into the warm blue world again, and then listen to what the American edition says. And we can think of a little bit about what Lewis may be doing here. He says, just as there are moments, this is the American edition, it's not in the original. And just as there are moments when simply to lie in bed and see the daylight pouring through your window and to hear the cheerful voice of an early postman or milkman down below and to realize it was only a dream, it wasn't real, is so heavenly that it was very nearly worth having the nightmare in order to have the joy of waking. So they all felt when they came out of the dark. That's an interesting way. So just like they come out and it feels so good to be awake that even the dream was almost worth it. And then they look around and Lord Roop says the same thing. I'm Lord Roop. Thanks for rescuing me. I have one request. Now, listen to in the first edition, the request was never take me back to the island. In the revised edition for America, this is what it says. What's the request? Never to ask me, nor to let any other ask me what I have seen during my years on the dark island. And Caspian replies, an easy one, my lord. Ask you? I should think not. I would give all my treasure not to hear it. And then as they go back, all afternoon with great joy, they sailed southeast with a fair wind, and this is new, and the hump of darkness grew smaller and smaller behind them. Now, this is really interesting. So in the original version, they come out of the dark island and they realize there was nothing ever to be afraid of. It's all fine. And when they turn back to look at the darkness, it's not even there. You destroyed it. It's gone. Hooray. In the revised edition, there's this sort of extended metaphor about the joy of waking up from a nightmare. And then instead of don't take me back there, it's don't ask me about what happened back there. Don't ask me all of what I saw. And then the darkness doesn't immediately disappear. Instead, it gets smaller and smaller as they journey away. And I think this is a really interesting revision that Lewis made to this edition, because gone is the sort of flippant dismissal of the dark island. Like, no big deal. You woke up. Nothing to be afraid of. Doesn't matter. Instead here, the terrors of the night are taken with a greater seriousness, perhaps. Right? Like, in other words, it doesn't just go away like that. It lingers. It's still back there. You can still see it. You can still feel it a little bit. And you don't want people to ask you about it and talk about it, because you don't want to go back there. You don't want to go back into despair. And even still, the joy of waking, the joy of morning is almost enough to make the nightmare worth it. And so it's a really interesting and more, I don't know, perhaps I think maybe a little more mature way of dealing with the fears that we face, the temptations we face of despair and depression and hopelessness that Lord Roop represents in the story. Because yes, Aslan delivers. Yes, he gives courage in the darkness and then leads out of the darkness. But sometimes that darkness hangs around. It doesn't just disappear, snap your fingers and it's gone. But sometimes it lingers. It kind of follows you a little bit. And I think showing that in that revised edition is a really, is to me a more meaningful and powerful display of the truth of the Christian life. I'm trying to think. Probably good for a start. There's lots more we could talk about. I'd love to talk about the duffel puds. I'd love to talk about the end of the journey. We'll get there for sure. But maybe now would be as good a time as any to let's go ahead and go and do some questions. So I don't know, KJ or Bill, whoever's coming back on with me here. Let's go ahead and do some questions and we can jump into some other things.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Interesting. I never knew about the alternative versions. Did Lewis ever expound much on that as to, was that a publisher's decision or did he feel uncomfortable with?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I've read about this. You know, the place that first turned me on to it was there's a book by a guy named Paul Ford called
Yes.
A Companion to Narnia, which is basically kind of a little encyclopedia. And I'm pretty sure that's where I picked up on it. And he talks a little bit more about the process. And it evades me right now. But if you want to follow up on on that change, I'm almost positive that in Paul Ford's A Companion to Narnia, it talks about that shift.
Okay, yeah, that's actually, his name came up when I was doing a little reading ahead of time this afternoon, just to brush up on some of the analysis. And I think it was him or one of the other not critics, but
Scholars,
experts. I didn't realize that in Voyage of the Dawn Treader, it's kind of neck and neck between Voyage of the Dawn Treader and the last battle, wherein Aslan shows up the least amount of times. He's the least present in these two books. Why do you think that might be?
Well, it's really actually interesting. I mean, here's one of the ways I'd at one level, he's he's absent in that, but his presence is there precisely when you need him. And I think that's a really important thing to recognize, is that in the moments that, if we think about that biblical passage, God will not allow you to be tempted beyond your ability to bear, but he'll provide a way of escape, right? I think it's 2 Corinthians. God will provide a way of escape. God's for you. He's, way of escape. The only question is, will you take it, right? So Lucy takes it in the first instance and then runs right past it in the second. And that's sort of what we see in the story, is that what makes the difference in each of these temptations and trials is the timely, ever-present, very present help in time of trouble. Aslan is there, breathing courage, just his face. I mean, that's what I find so encouraging about it, is in the grip of greed, all it takes is, Aslan's face, and boom, you wake up. Or vanity, Aslan's face, and you wake up. The other example of this, the other temptation that we could talk about, is Caspian's own temptation at the end of the book, when they're journeying to the utter east, because they have to break the enchantment by going as far as they can. So 3 of the lords are under an enchantment on Ramandu's island, the last 3 lords. And the only way to wake them up is to go to the farthest east you can and leave somebody. And of course, Reepicheep's like, I'm in, dude. That's what I wanted my whole life, is to be left at the end of the world. And so they're journeying there. And when they get to the utter east and the water turns sweet and they're going to let Reepicheep down, Caspian turns to all the guys and says, I'm going too. And then he gets rebuked, right, by his men and by Edmund, saying, you can't do that. You're the king. You're not allowed to leave your post. If any other guy did this, you'd hang him as a deserter. You don't have the right. You have responsibilities. You have a job to do. You made promises to Trumpkin that you're going to come back. You made promises to Ramandu's daughter. You said you were going to marry her, right? And now all of a sudden you're like, I'm going to Aslan's country. And he eventually relents and says, fine, but then he kind of does it in this really angry way. And he's like, fine, if I don't get to go, nobody goes. Reepicheep doesn't get to go. And he goes and like slams the door into his cabin, and then comes out a little while later with tears in his eyes and humbled, because the face of Aslan sort of appears to him there and like speaks to him and rebukes him for his sinfulness, for his ambition and his neglect of his duty. Yeah. And so again, in each of these cases, it's just Aslan comes not always as the lion who's going to have a conversation with you. He does have one with Lucy, but more often just it's a sight, it's a glimpse, it's, Aslan breaks through, and that's the thing that delivers you from the temptation or from the trial. And so there's a way in which he's very present, and I found it this time. I zeroed in on that theme more than I think I ever have. I talk about it some in Live Like an Narnian. But it really was an encouragement to me this time, is that encountering Aslan, just seeing him, delivers us from temptation, and living in Aslan's presence, or we would say, if we want to use biblical language, abiding in Christ. Yeah. John 15, abiding in Christ is the way to be delivered. Maybe one other comment on this is when Lucy, she finally finds the spell to turn everything visible again and recites it. And then Aslan like kind of pops up right there and oh, you've come. He's like, I've been here the whole time. I was just invisible. You made me visible. And she's like, come on. You're saying I made you visible? Yeah. And he said, what? You don't think I'd obey my own rules? and I think the way that we're supposed to take that is God keeps his promises, right? Like the point is God keeps his promises. God obeys his own rules. God keeps his promises. And so when you need him, you call upon him and you find him, he'll show up, he'll be there. Don't turn aside because he doesn't feel present. Believe that he is present and keep pressing in, keep crying out, keep saying, God, if you ever loved us, come help me now, and don't quit. Cry out to him, and he keeps his promises.
Well, he comes in a couple different forms too. And before you maybe share the significance of that, I just want to remind everybody, if you use the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen towards the right, it's a separate window that'll pop up. That's where you can submit your questions. If you put your questions in the chat window, we're going to lose track because there's a lot of good banter going on back and forth amongst yourselves, and we'll lose track. So use the Q&A function if you can, and we'll get to those questions. But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the significance, and then we'll turn to the questions that are jumping into the window. the significance of the different, kinds of.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
He comes when he,
Yeah, so he does show up in different ways, sort of as himself, walking on Deathwater. In the book, you get the picture in, I think it's like a painting or some kind of decoration in Caspian's cabin. And I think part of that is simply to demonstrate that God does meet us in various ways according to what he's coming as an albatross, which is an interesting one. I think is drawn from there's sort of medieval traditions behind that and sort of connecting Christ.
That's the one I was most curious of. I mean, him coming as a lamb. Yeah, there's pretty explicit biblical imagery there, but the albatross was an interesting.
Yeah, and I'm fairly sure, and I'm not going to have it at the tip of my tongue here probably, but I think that there's some medieval allegorizing involving the albatross and Christ, and so it's interesting that he looks like a cross first, and then you realize it's an albatross, and there's some sort of connection, and it's just eluding me. So. But I'm sure somebody do a quick.
Somebody in the chat ought to look that up and let us know.
That's right.
I think you're right. He is a medievalist, right? So
it is. And then of course, somebody mentions in the chat there, you've got Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which also maybe.
So Joe,
yeah.
Joe, I'm reading from A Field Guide to Narnia.
Yeah.
And it says the large albatross, the large seabird, leads the dawn treader out of the terrifying blackness surrounding the dark island. This is a long maritime tradition of the albatross as guide and harbinger of good fortune, featured in Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner.
Right, and of course the I don't know, hard thing in that story, right, is that the mariner had killed an albatross and so is now forced to kind of carry it on his neck because he basically killed good fortune. He ruined it. So there you go. There's some
the albatross around your neck.
The albatross around your neck. That's where that comes from. That's right.
Yeah, that's right. That's just, I should know that.
I do think maybe one other element of how he delivers is when Lucy's reading the book, she reads a spell that actually ends up being more like a story, and it's sort of like the greatest story ever. And then she can't remember it, but like she's always sort of like hearkening back to this story, and trying to remember it. And says, Aslan, are you ever going to tell me that story again? He says, I'm going to be telling it to you forever. And I think Lewis here is sort of hearkening to his notion of joy, or Sehnsucht, that kind of longing, that inconsolable longing for we know not what, that was awakened in him in various ways. And it was here through the spell or a story that kind of enchanted Lucy, and that sort of the rest of her life. And when she says that was a good story, it was a story that reminded her of that. And this shows up in a lot of Lewis's writings. It's in Surprised by Joy. He describes it most directly. But in his allegorical telling of his conversion in A Pilgrim's Regress, it's the island, like the faraway island that he sort of sees, that the character John is always trying to find. How do I get to that island? How do I get to that island? And so there's another way that Aslan sort of shows up as a signpost to sort of awaken keep pressing, keep journeying, find where all of the joy is coming from. I want to find where the joy is coming from, and so we get a little taste of that here as well with Lucy in the story.
Okay, great. We're hitting all genres. I studied a little bit of Coleridge in college. I should remember that. Okay, well, Kyle is asking about Eustace. He says, Eustace is a very well-constructed character. Who do you think were sources that Lewis used to create this character?
Part of me wonders if it's himself, right? That that he may recognize himself a little bit in Eustace's, there's a kind of arrogance in Eustace, sort of a desire to sort of be grown up and put other people down. And Lewis was a sharp kid, and he was insecure in some ways, especially as it pertained to like sports and being one of the cool kids. But he was a very smart kid, and so there was kind of a little bit there. So I wonder how much there's a little bit of Lewis knows Eustace because there's enough Eustace in Lewis. Beyond that, I'm not sure if there were other particular individuals in his life or other even, books that he's reading. We know that, the Pevensies harken back a little bit to Edith Nesbit's Samiad trilogy, or the 4 children in it, or 5 children in it. And so there's precedent for sort of these sort of 5 siblings who find themselves in all sorts of adventures. And Lewis seems to have sort of taken up that idea in crafting the Pevensies, but I don't know if there's a particular character in literature that Eustace is hearkening to.
Well, his own encounter with the Great Knock was probably a humiliating experience for a little while there as well.
That's right.
You can imagine him, being humbled as Eustace was as well. Interesting. You mentioned that he had the 5 kids, but we don't get all 5 kids in this story.
Yeah, that's right. So it's the idea of here's 4 siblings. There's all sorts of versions of this even now. Boxcar Children sort of runs with this idea. I think that there's another British novelist, children's novelist. I forget her name, Edith Bly, maybe, that does a similar thing with sort of siblings who get swept up in adventures. But this is one of the things that Tolkien sort of didn't like about the Narnia books was it felt like a mishmash, and that Lewis was sort of grabbing, the children from Edith Nesbit and the Snow Queen from Hans Christian Andersen and Father Christmas and Greek mythology and just kind of like slamming it together. And Tolkien doesn't like that kind of slamming it together. He wants there to be more internal consistency, and didn't find that to be the case in Narnia.
Maybe Lewis was the father of the mashup.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and this is one of those places where Tolkien was wrong.
Well, we can agree on that one. Not many of those times, but I hope that answers the question, Kyle. I'm not familiar with Lewis writing really anything on that explicitly. Kyle follows up and asks, you mentioned how the characters are snapped out of their temptation towards greed and vanity by fear of Aslan. Given that you've just written a book on overcoming lustful temptations, what lessons can we learn from Narnia about overcoming temptation?
That's a good question.
Did you actually say that it was fear of Aslan or an encounter with Aslan? Because I don't know that we always resist temptation simply by fear.
That's right. So it's certainly the case in some cases that it's fear. So when Lucy's Aslan's growling at her and coming out of sort of his face is in a snarl almost. Yeah. And it's that kind of wakes her up. Whereas in the other case, it's simply his presence. So I think that part of the point is the lessons are there are a variety of things that the Lord provides for us in scripture and other places as things that are designed to arrest our attention or to snap us out. Yeah. And that there's ways in which we ought to use our imaginations, not to sort of our imagination is dangerous, right? It's a very dangerous thing. It's a good thing, but it can also become a very bad thing. It's the doorway through which we are tempted frequently, as Lucy is, imagining herself as sort of the more beautiful one who's triumphing over everyone, or Eustace thinking dragonish thoughts and imagining what can I do with all this money. And so there's ways in which our imagination, on the one hand, is the tool whereby we're tempted, and then our will sees that image that we've created and says yes, right? And on the other side, our imagination is the thing that we can redeploy. And that's part of what Lewis is doing here with writing a fairy tale to help us see this is, be like this. Here's the characters you ought to want to be like. Use your imagination to envision this kind of character, be this kind of character. In Mere Christianity, he calls this good pretending, where you sort of imagine what you would be like if you were full of Jesus, right? If you knew that God loved you and you knew that you loved God, and imagine if you were really full of the love of God, what would you do? And then he says, once you imagine that, then basically pray for God and go do it, right? Sort of live into that vision of yourself as opposed to sulking and feeling sorry for yourself or imagining some other version of yourself here, as many of the characters do in the grip of temptation. And I think there's different ways that then, so the imagination is a really important thing. And I think is a really, in the book that was mentioned it's called More Than a Battle. And I've got a whole chapter in that book called Good Pretending, as a way of using the imagination in the fight, in that case against sexual sin, but in principle against all sins.
It's a great answer. The great use of Lewis. Lewis's applications seemingly know no end. Okay, Lisa asks, what is the significance of Eustace encountering the dragon he watched die and then later ate?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think probably that one thing it's meant to do is it's to show us, it's to account for what happened to whichever is Octavian. I forget which lord it is, but the most likely thing is that this was one of those Narnian lords who himself, maybe encountered another dragon on the island in a similar fashion, and became a dragon, and then was forced to sort of live out his days as a dragon on the island. Yeah, he doesn't. That guy didn't get the Aslan encounter, or perhaps rejected the Aslan encounter and stayed a dragon forever. And so it's to sort of show here's the dragon. That's why the loot's there, and therefore this accounts for why Eustace is dragoned in the Valley of the Dragon. which again is simply a revelation of what he has been the entire book. He has been a dragon. And then I would say the significance of eating it is simply Lewis trying to gross you out a little bit and kind of go, this is what we do. Like, viper devours viper, dragon eats dragon. And there's a way in which, that turn inward, eventually we devour ourselves. We eat up ourselves. And so in eating the dragon, there's a way in which it's showing that it's a way of displaying sort of the horror of self-will and self-love, which in fact shows up, I think, also with the Dufflepuds when we get to talk about them.
That's good. That's good insight. It's interesting too, because that kind of feeds into his realization that he's alone. Eustace not wanting to be alone, that maybe resisting that turn in on himself. Okay, so Elma asks, why were we not privy to that conversation that King Caspian had at the end with Aslan?
Yeah, because nobody's told other people's stories. Well, so I mean, there's this notion in Narnia, right, where Lucy in this story asks about when she's rebuked for eavesdropping. She sort of starts running down, well, what would have happened? Would we have become best friends and lifelong buddies if I hadn't heard this conversation? And Aslan says, no one's ever told what would have happened. You have the one life that you can live. You can imagine what would have happened, but no one's ever told what would have happened. And then there's a couple of other allusions, when we talk about the end of the book. This is actually be interesting to talk about. The end of the book, when they reach Aslan's country, in many ways, this book is suffused, I think, with the Gospel of John. So I think I think this is right. My memory is so bad. When I was in high school, I had to write kind of a literary analysis paper in like my senior year of high school. And I wrote it, I think, on the Voyage of the Dawn Treader and sort of the Christian symbolism in it. And thought I was, quite clever. Look what I discovered, as though nobody else had ever seen that before. But I remember, of course, obviously you mentioned the lamb, where we see the lamb at the end of the book when they're walking along the shore, and there's a lamb that says, come and eat. And there's a number of different echoes of the Gospel of John. The lamb cooks them fish in the same way that Jesus, at the end of the Gospel of John, the disciples are out fishing, and he says, cast on the other side. They cast it, they bring in a huge haul, and then they realize it's the Lord. And Peter dives in the water and goes, and he comes up, and Jesus is cooking fish. Says, let's sit down and eat. And they have this conversation about feed my lambs. And then the other thing, I think at the end of that, in the end of the book, is there's an allusion to the end of the gospel where Peter is, where Jesus says that I think he tells Peter that you're going to be basically crucified like I am, crucified upside down. He tells him what kind of death he was going to die. And then Peter asks about John, what about that guy? What's going to happen to him? And Jesus says, if I wanted to stay alive till I come, what's that to you? You follow me. Yep. And it's that same sort of idea. And we see that at the end of the book with, that they have this nobody's ever told other people's stories. Nobody ever told what happens to other people, but you need to know your story. And so there's other examples of that. I think the recurring image of light drawing on the sun, right? So Jesus is the light of the world. Light shines in the darkness. The darkness has not overcome it, obviously related to the dark island. So there's all sorts of really fruitful ways that if you read the Voyage of the Dawn Treader and then you read the Gospel of John, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, of course, that's the Lamb. And then actually one of the greatest ones is when they come up to the Lamb and they're talking about Aslan being in this world. And Edmund says, are you there too, sir? Meaning in our world. And Aslan simply says, I am. And of course, that's a very Gospel of John sort of statement by Christ. Before Abraham was, I am. And so there's all sorts of really interesting, I think it's one of the thicker biblical Narnian chronicles. All of them have these sort of elements, right? So the crucifixion and resurrection in Lion, the Witch and Wardrobe and so forth. But this one is really suffused with a lot of particular John type imagery from the gospel.
Great observation. I don't think you might have picked up on it originally in college. I think other than with the lamb, I don't think I picked up that across the board. Well, let's follow this with Caspian. Stephen asks if there's any meaning behind the fact that Caspian doesn't make it to the utter east in this book, and his son doesn't quite make it to the center of the earth in the silver chair. So do you think maybe there's connection?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting question. Perhaps there's a way in which, our earthly desires, our desires on earth always sort of fall short of their object. Like you're never able to do everything that you want to do. And the desire to sort of do more and more and more in a sort of endless way is at one level a pointer, I think, to eternity and, in the presence of God, who is an infinite fountain of joy. And that's where that's meant to terminate. But the corollary of that is our earthly lives are always going to fall short, not just in the sort of like we're all sinners sense, but just we can't do everything that we want to do. And so maybe there is something to that. I hadn't quite, I know they comment on it in Silver Chair. When we get to that book next time, we'll talk.
Yeah, maybe you can file that one in the back of your mind as we review the next one next month.
Yeah.
Good question. Lisa asks if there's any special takeaways from the many delights observed in the last sea. And she notes very vivid imagery. Yeah.
So one of the other places I think Lewis is drawing on in this story of the voyage to the end of the world is actually Dante's Paradiso, which is the third canticle of the Divine Comedy. And the reason I say that is because in Dante's Divine Comedy, as the character Dante is the pilgrim journeying up through the different spheres of the heavens on his way to the presence of God beyond the universe. Everything's bright, and as he gets higher, it gets brighter, and he gets more able to see it. Right. So as he's sort of purified on his way up, or grows in knowledge, there's times where he's sort of blinded and he has to look away. And then in Dante, he looks to Beatrice, his guide. And when he looks at her and sees her face, that sort of strengthens his eyes so that he can then turn back and see what had formerly blinded him. So on the one hand, it gets brighter. His eyes become acclimated. They become like eagle's eyes, which is a comparison that's made in the line which the word, or in the Voyage of the Treader. And so I think there's ways in which a lot of that vivid imagery is Lewis is there's similar stuff in Dante's Divine Comedy that's meant to give you kind of the richness and fullness of, as you near the presence of God, we're groping language. And so Lewis is really trying to bring all of our senses into play. And so what does it smell like? There's one place where it smells like purple. And Caspian's like, it totally smells like purple. And Edmund's like, what does that even mean? And so it smells like purple. There's warm scents. There's delicious scents coming across the lily on the island. And as they're sort of moving through the island with no breeze, but a current that's carrying them through, and it's getting brighter all around them, and they drink the water, and that enables them to see, even to look straight into the sun. I think all of these things, so there's a visual and an oral, like a aural, as the birds fly by singing a song in human voices, but in a language that nobody knows, but this beautiful song. And so the ears and the eyes and the nose and the mouth, all of them are engaged as our senses are overwhelmed as we get closer and closer. So I think that's the big purpose, which again, Lewis is doing from Dante for sure. And trying to give us, we're always just, as we get closer to what is God like, who is God, what will it be like to see him face to face? We're always just groping for images to try to awaken some taste for what that is.
Yeah, I think it was his colleague at Oxford, I think his name was Austin Farrar, who made the comment that one of the real strengths Lewis had was depiction, the way that he could depict these things for us so we could just see them in our minds, and in this case, gauge all the senses. One of those imageries that, depictions that he used here that really spoke to me was drinkable light. That was really quite, who would think to match drinkable and light together?
That's right. And there's another drinkable gold. Where's that from? I think that's in Lewis too. There's another someplace else. But maybe here's a biblical observation that may be an interesting one for everybody to consider. In the Bible, there's like in the biblical imagery, gold and honey and light are all kind of, sometimes there's a way in which they all kind of fuse together. So let's see, honey is like eatable gold.
Land of milk and honey.
So, you know, taste and see that the Lord is good. Your word is sweeter than honey. That's the sort of idea. So there's so honey is like drinking gold, and gold is like solid light. And so there, and of course you can think about just the color, like they're all sort of this yellow, bright, brilliant kind of color, and all of them are at various times used as a comparison to the word of God, right? So the word of God, the law of the Lord is sweeter than honey. Taste and see that the Lord is good. The law of the Lord is as a light, lamp unto our feet, a light unto our path. It's more precious than gold. This, again, Psalm 19 is where some of that's coming from. And so there's ways in which those images of, and they're different. Like one's something you taste, one's something that you value because it's a precious metal, and then one's the thing you see by, and all of them are supposed to help us get a sense of this is what we have in the Bible. So I think Lewis sort of loves to sort of play with those different, like you said, drinkable light is a great vivid imagery. Like what would it be like to drink light?
He would have had a great career as a marketer, wouldn't he? So Randy asks, any thoughts on why the seven lords and the assignment to find them?
You know, one of the
basically where comes the seven lords?
Yeah, so the seven lords obviously show up in the you know, they're sort of mentioned in passing in Prince Caspian as those loyal to Caspian's father who were sent away by Miraz in order to get rid of them. I think part of the reason for the idea of them on a journey to the east on the water is part of what Lewis is doing in all of the Chronicles is he's trying to take you through the entire world that he has built. So if you think about the stories, the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and Prince Caspian both take place in sort of Narnia proper. But then in the world of Narnia, or this imaginary sub-created world that Lewis made, there's lands to the north, there's lands to the south, and then there's the east. And there's actually stuff to the west that were sort of the Western wild. And so you've got those four directions, north, south, east, and west. And Lewis, over the course of the novels, wants to take us to all of them. And so this is the one that's going to take us as a journey to the east. Next time we talk about Silverchair, that's a journey north. We're going up into the giant lands, we're in Ettensmuir, where the giants live. And so we're going to explore what's up there in the north. And then in Horse and His Boy, we go south to Calormen and what's down there across the great desert in Calormen. And then in The Last Battle, a lot of that takes place at Cauldron Pool, which is on the western edge of Narnia towards the Western Wild. And so part of the reason for some of these setups is this is Lewis sort of taking us all over the map so that you can see the whole of this world that he has invented.
And we had just had a question. I want to make sure I had it right. They were asking about the book you mentioned on temptation.
Oh, yeah.
It was More Than a Battle, right?
More Than a Battle, Finding Victory, Freedom, and Healing from Lust. It's a book I just came here in February, but on mainly helping men deal with sexual temptation and pornography, and then helping men who are trying to help those guys know how to do it better. So it's written for both the guys who are struggling and the guys who are trying to help the guys who are struggling. So
great. I want to make sure the title right. I put it in the chat for everybody along with the other book titles, so you can check those out. So we have an anonymous person asking about what are your thoughts on Corrigan, the fallen star who's being punished on the island of the Duffers. What do you think the significance of that is? Yeah,
so this is an interesting thing. The use of stars. One of the chapters in my book is on Live Like a Narnian is on the stars and the significance of them here in this book. Where, of course, the famous quote when they're talking to Crayakin and they said, and Eustace said, "Oh, he's a retired star," or I guess they're talking to Ramandu. He's a fallen star, and Eustace says, "In our world, a star is a huge ball of flaming gas." And he replies, "Even in your world, my son, that's not what a star is, but just what it's made of." And the idea there is that our modern tendency is to reduce things to their sort of material components. So it's reductionistic. We sort of say, what are we? We're just matter in motion. We're just chemicals banging around. We reduce down to their material components. And Lewis doesn't like this. He doesn't want us to reduce things down to matter in motion, but instead to recognize matter is a real thing. It's what we are made of. But there's more than what we are made of. There's what we are. And so here he's doing the same thing by using stars. So stars are huge. They're made of, huge balls of flaming gas. But what are they? Well, in this book, they're people. And in our world, the biblical sort of picture is that there's a deep connection in the Bible between stars and angelic beings. So in the book of Job, when God lays the foundation of the world, the morning stars sang for joy, right? The sons of God, the morning star, sang for joy. And so there's the idea that the stars are angels, or the stars in their courses fought against Sisera in the book of Job, or the host of heaven, that language of the host of heaven. On the one hand, in the Bible, sometimes it's the same phrase, refers to the stars in the night sky, and other times refers to kind of angelic armies, and that you shouldn't bow down to the host of heaven, to these false gods. When in the book of Revelation, when Satan falls, he sweeps a third of the stars out of the sky. So there's this deep connection in the Bible between stars and angels. That's a really interesting thing to explore. That I think is more than mere metaphor. Okay, and I think Lewis thought was more than mere metaphor as well. And in terms of Karayakin, I think part of the issue there is we often have these sort of questions about, like, what are angels doing all the time? The sort of the spiritual realm. We know that it exists, principalities and powers. We wage war not against flesh and blood, but against these forces of darkness. We know that angels are there and they're active. God has ministering spirits sent out to serve for the sake of those who are inherit salvation. So we know angels are real. We know demons are real. And yet we have all kinds of questions, like, what are they doing? How did the devil fall? How did the rest of the angels fall, if those that fell? And part of what Lewis is doing by Karayakin is sort of gesturing toward that biblical reality. There's a world beyond just the human world, and yet it's a world we've not been told about. And so in Narnia, it's like, you're a son of Adam, and so you can't really be told sort of the sorts of things that a star might get punished for. That's sort of above your pay grade. That's not any of your business. Sort of, you follow me. That's the kind of idea. And so I think that's part of what Lewis is doing there, is trying to, show us that the world itself is crowded with more than just human beings and stuff, but that there are other beings in play, and and God has business with them, and they're doing things in relation to the whole cosmic story. But we don't always know all the answers, and we should be content to not know those things that we can't know.
So angels aren't just looking for their George Bailey trying to earn their wings?
That's right.
Okay, so Penelope's kind of got a two-part question, and it's phrased as a sentence, so I'm going to try to draw the question out of it here. She mentioned that Lewis had been asked about his first book regarding the symbolism, so you're talking about metaphor a moment ago, but the symbolism in his stories, particularly like Aslan dying in the place of Edmund being punished, plus Stone Table, but that he had denied he was doing anything with Christianity, that he was just writing. Do you think this was unconscious, or that he couldn't remember where he borrowed the idea from, or was this maybe, I would add to this, was it maybe intentional on his part?
Yeah.
Because I don't think I'd heard him. I don't think I've ever read explicitly him denying that. But
so I'd have to look at see what I'm not familiar with the quote where he says that he didn't. It also would be very Lewis-like to kind of be cagey and secretive about it. That's a very Lewis-like thing. It's pretty clear that by the end, once he gets into the stories, when he's corresponding with the kids who are writing to him about how much they love it, there's the great little letter where a mom writes to Lewis very concerned because her son loves Aslan more than Jesus. And this is, oh no, my son loves Aslan more than Jesus. And Lewis tries to reassure her, well, if he's loving Aslan, he's loving Aslan because Aslan is like Jesus. And so, or he's loving Jesus in Aslan, in the depiction of Aslan. And so don't, sort of, he'll grow up out of that. That's part of what these stories are going to do. Maybe now's a good enough time to talk about a little episode at the end when they are talking with Aslan as he, lamb become lion. And then they say, you got to go back to your world. And Lucy says, are you going to tell me that story? And he says, of course, I'll be telling it to you all the time. And then he says, you got to go back into your own country. The door into Aslan's country is from your own world. You don't get to come into my country from Narnia. You have to come into my world from your world. And Edmund's like, wait, we can get into your country from our world? This is amazing. How do we do that? How do we get into Aslan's country from our world? And will you tell us? And then Aslan says, I shall be telling you all the time, but I will not tell you how long or how short the way will be, only that it lies across a river, which I think is a reference to death. It's probably drawing on Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, where the last part of the journey for a pilgrim is across a great river to the celestial city, and so that's death. He's got to go across death. But do not fear that, for I am the great bridge builder. He'll take you through death and beyond. And then when they say, are we going to need to come back to Narnia? He says, no, you're never coming back to Narnia. You're too old, and you must begin to come close to your own world now. And then Lucy cries and says, well, it's not mainly Narnia that we care about. It's you. How can we live never meeting you? But you shall meet me, dear one, said Aslan. Are you there too, sir? Said Edmund. I am. There's the John reference. But there I have another name. You must learn to know me by that name. This was the very reason why you were brought to Narnia, that binding me here for a little, you may know me better there, which of course is sort of the banner that kind of waves over all of this sort of stuff. Why did Lewis write these? Fundamentally, so that we could come to know Jesus in Narnia and then learn to know him by his true name here, which is what he tells Lawrence's, I think the kid's name's Lawrence. Lawrence's mom says, don't worry. If he learns to love Aslan, then as he grows, he'll begin to recognize and know Aslan by his true name here.
Yeah, so just a quick comment on that. Sometimes I get questions about, these questions are related to whether the Chronicles are allegory. Mm-hmm. And so just a quote here from a letter that Lewis wrote. This is a few days after Christmas in 1958. So this is, toward the end of his life. Well, toward the latter years. By an allegory, I mean a composition, whether pictorial or literary, in which immaterial realities are represented as feigned physical objects. So he refers to Bunyan, and mm-hmm. If Aslan represented the immaterial deity in the same way in which the giant despair represents despair, he would be an allegorical figure. In reality, however, he is an invention giving an imaginary answer to the question, what might Christ become like if there really were a world like Narnia, and he chose to become incarnate and die and rise again in that world as he actually has done in ours. This is not allegory at all. So when we're saying that that the Aslan, the stone table, all that is, he's not saying that, he's not making that an exact representation of Christ, but he is framing the story in such a way that it's obvious, what the similarity.
Yep.
So
that's helpful.
Yeah, and Penelope came back and mentioned she read that in a news article. I asked her which one. If she finds it, she can post it, and we can share it just for our own edification. But maybe he denied it, and it was in a conversation with Tolkien. Maybe
that's right.
He was giving him a hard time. How would you love to have been sitting there at the Eagle and Child or in the Rabbit Room listening to those discussions where Tollers was giving him a hard time for his book, and him just
can't do that. Back. You can't do that, Lewis. And Lewis says, "Watch me."
And the unseen voice for everybody is Bill Smith. He's Bill and I take turns emceeing these. He's the director for the Institute in Atlanta, so he's behind the scenes doing the fact checking for us today. Okay, so Elma asks about the Mermaid People. Who or what do you think they represent?
Well, so Lewis has this sort of notion. He does this here. He does it also in the Ransom trilogy, especially in Perelandra, that we sort of assume that the cosmos is, massive, huge, and the only action is happening right here on little old planet Earth. And Lewis says, basically, in a number of different modes, well, probably not. There may be all sorts of other things that God is up to in other places in the cosmos, including on this planet in relation to, say, angelic beings, that we just don't have any idea about, and that aren't part of our story, but are a part of the story. And so he likes to constantly drop in things like the Mer people to say they're a part of Aslan's story. Aslan cares about them too. Aslan has purposes for them too. You go, well, what are they? He says, you don't need to know that. That's, you follow me, right? You're told what you need to know for the character that you are in the story. But if there are angelic wars in other parts of the galaxy that we may discover someday, right? When we're in heaven and we're seeing the whole picture finally. There may be all sorts of things like, wow, that was going on while our little planet. Yes. And so Lewis really had this notion that that there might be more going on that doesn't concern human beings, and it doesn't intersect with us exactly, other than it's all part of the story that God is telling, big story. So I think that's part of what he's doing with Mermaid People. Plus it's a very classical mythological sort of thing. If you're going to do a sea voyage, then you got to have mermaids. You got to have the siren reference to the sirens, Odysseus being tied to the mast when the sirens call for him, lest he be tempted to jump overboard and to his death. And so you're going to have those sorts of elements in a story like this.
Yeah. Okay. Trevor asks, C.S. Lewis was so good at imagining life as seen from other people's point of view, like the seahorse riders and their castle living on a hill instead of valley for their good undersea reasons. I think there was a missing word in there. Yeah. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, this is he tries to turn the world upside down a little bit. In fact, if you want to chase that one down, in Paralandra, there's a similar scene where Ransom, Paralandra, Venus is a watery planet, and there's sea people, and at one point Ransom sort of eats some of the sea people food, and it's sort of like the universe gets turned inside out for him, and he starts to sort of see he feels like I'm on top of the water and that's down, and instead he sort of starts to see things from their perspective, as though like the real world is down under the water and sort of the mythological world is the one above the water. Like that's where all of the weird stuff happens, and it sort of turns him inside out. It's a really fascinating little bit there, kind of imagining what it would be like seeing things again from a different perspective.
Okay, last one. I don't know if there's a straight answer for this. I don't remember there being one, but how long was Ramandu a star?
I think he said just ages and ages. It was sort of like, and again, this is sort of a Lewisism of demonstrating like, humanity's history is relatively brief, cosmically speaking. Now, depending on, your view of the age of the earth and so forth, but Lewis seems to have accepted more of an old earth perspective on that question. And so was it simply, billions upon billions of years of no intelligent anything? And his view is this is kind of what Ramandu's long voyages is that the great dance which he's treading, the great dance of the stars, the actions of the angelic host was going on for ages upon ages before human beings came on the scene, and it was good. The great dance doesn't wait for us to get started. It's always been going on because God himself has this sort of unity and diversity and the great dance in himself, and then creates angels that are doing all sorts of stuff. And so again, I think that's sort of the gesture he's making is the world is big and cosmic, and there's God's up to all sorts of stuff. And that shouldn't lead us mainly to like speculation about, well, I wonder what they were doing, but instead to say, you have your place in the great dance. You have your calling, you have your thing. And this is a good place, to mention. So with the Dufflepuds, we're the Dufflepuds. We are the creatures who want to rule ourselves. So if you'll notice about them, the constant refrain is, he tried to make us do something, and we said we didn't want to do it. Why? Because we didn't want to. And so just sort of the repeated use of this sort of self-will idea that they just want to do what they want to do. And why did we turn ourselves invisible? Because we wanted to. And there's sort of this self-will thing, and they're being governed, of course, by a star. And they're both stupid and rebellious, but kind of in a cuddly sort of way, like a warm-hearted sort of way. There's a little bit of a patronizing tone to Crike, and I love these foolish little creatures, and he's charged with helping to learn to govern themselves, and this is his punishment. And so we're the Dufflepuds, and if you look at the way that the chief and the rest of the Dufflepuds relate to one another, the chief says something and they just echo whatever it is, and it's all nonsense and it doesn't make sense. And it's very simplistic. And I think Lewis is trying to help us to see, like, this is what we are in the universe. We're very, very small. We're very, very insignificant. Often we're very, very stupid. And yet God still loves us, has compassion on us. And he's trying to grow us up into maturity. And so I think there's a great little illustration. So if you read the Dufflepuds and you just think, this is us, this is what human beings are. And this might be how human beings look to angels, right? And there's a notion of, their projection onto Karayakin. He's this evil magician who wants to, get at us. And really he's this benevolent magician who's like, hey, I'm for your good. You don't have to go up into the mountains and carry buckets down from the thing. The stream literally runs right by your house. Just go out and drink. And they're like, no, we're going to do it our way. And it's a stupid way. And this is Lewis's depiction of human society, of human beings from the perspective of angels. So the same way that we sort of see the mer people from a human perspective and are kind of turned inside out. Likewise, we get to see human beings, I think, from an angelic perspective in all of our folly and sinfulness, and yet God's care for us nonetheless. Maybe the last little bit I'll say is a very poignant moment for me reading through it this last time was when they're on Ramandu's island. They're talking to Ramandu's daughter, and there's the food sitting out there, and they say, how do we know that this isn't enchanted food that's going to be bad? And how do we know that you're a good person? You seem really nice. I want to believe you, but how can I know? And her answer is, well, you can't know ahead of time. You have to just choose. You either believe or you don't. And I think that this is one of the things Lewis does in so many of his writings, is tries to bring you to the point to say, at some level, at the end of the day, God sort of presents himself and says, choose. You can have me or not. You can believe or not. And there's all kinds of good reasons to believe, but you don't get to know ahead of time all of the answers. You don't get to know ahead of time how all things are going to turn out. You don't get to tell what's happened to other people. The choice facing you is believe or not. And of course, and this is where Reepicheep really becomes, a model kind of character who's willing to take the risk and says, hey, fill up the wine, I'll do it. And that's a sort of a model for us of saying, yes, it's risky. Yes, there's dangers. Yes, there's challenges. Yes, there's trials, temptations, etc. But Aslan obeys his own rules. God keeps his promises, and that's what the Voyage of the Dawn Treader is trying to show us.
I think we'll leave it there. Thanks, Joe.